right. So hey everyone. My name is Paul Reese, and I'm a developer programs engineer on Firebase at Google. So today we're actually going to talk about two tools, Flutter and Firebase, and how they can be used for rapid prototyping. So whether it's at a hackathon with only one weekend to build something presentable, or you have an idea for an app that you want to test out before really investing in it, a lot of us have been in a situation where we want to build something that just gets the job done quickly. So during the normal prototype development process, developers plan out their apps and what they should do, how they should function, research the feasibility of the idea, map out their architecture, pick their tools, and then build a clean and organized prototype, right? So yes and no. Some people stick to a very formal process, but when building out a quick prototype or even just a proof of concept app, most of us, myself included, just want to open up an IDE and then start coding, and then we'll kind of figure it out as we go along. So given this, I'm going to talk about the two tools that I just mentioned earlier, Flutter and Firebase. Both of these are easy to use and address different development problems. Flutter is for client-side development, and then Firebase is for the backend. Both are designed to be easy to use, and they're well supported with content and documentation to make getting up and running as easy as possible. So while I wouldn't say this is necessarily going to be a deep dive, this presentation is going to look at some code and tools that will hopefully be helpful in getting you started with Flutter and Firebase. So while it might seem like a lot up front, I can't stress enough that you don't need to memorize everything. This is also going to be a condensed version of this presentation, but everyone can definitely reach out to me either on Twitter or email and all that. That'll all be at the end of the presentation, or I'll post my slides up online as well. So you can see the code and don't have to worry about trying to write it down or take screenshots or any of that. It'll be available for you later on. So with that, let's actually go ahead and just get started with this. So first, let's talk about Flutter. It's a UI toolkit that uses the Dart programming language for building native apps for multiple platforms on top of C++. And it's actually using a 2D engine that's called Skia. This is the same graphical engine that's going to be used by Chrome, Android, and a few other platforms. And it's all from this one single SDK. So since everything is built from a single code base, you can create your prototypes for multiple systems, such as Android or iOS, without requiring specific developer knowledge about each of those platforms. This actually also carries over to web. Flutter is doing great with web. Firebase is picking up all the features, so it's not parity yet, but it's getting there. Flutter is also completely open source, which is great. So not only is Google working on it, but so are many members of the developer community. Rather than being walled off from the internal workings of the tool, you can actually dig into the code to see exactly how Flutter is doing, what it's doing, as well as send your own pull requests if you want to improve it. So far, there's been about 18,000 contributions from what I last remember. And it's all from the global development community into Flutter, and that number just keeps going up as more people are discovering and trying out this platform. So aside from Flutter being cross-platform, you're probably wondering when you should use it for rapid prototyping, especially since there's already other tools out there that exist and do similar things. So like most development decisions, the answer is basically, it depends. While Flutter isn't the only tool that can work cross-platform, it is designed from the ground up specifically for creating apps quickly. It's able to easily tie into device hardware using external plugins and packages that can be imported into your project. And it uses widgets, which we'll dig into a bit more here soon, to create UI components programmatically rather than requiring something like a layout file or a storyboard. One other feature of Flutter that I think is just super valuable also is hot reloading. So you don't actually need to restart your entire app to test out small UI changes and things like that. Instead, those UI changes will automatically be applied to your running app as you change various values and then just save the files in the IDE. So following up on the it depends answer, there's also going to be times when Flutter isn't the right solution for you. And it's kind of better to figure that out early on in the development process rather than doing a whole bunch of work and then finding out that it's not the right tool for you. So for starters, while games are a lot of fun to develop, Flutter just isn't really at a point where you can make most types of games quick enough to call it a rapid prototype. You'll need to write a lot of components from scratch that other platforms currently give you out of the box. Additionally, calling native APIs directly just isn't really super easy. Normally, you would write native Swift or Kotlin code and then use platform channels to communicate back and forth into the native level through a bridging process. So while it isn't necessarily a deal breaker, it is more work than just throwing some UI together and then calling it good. The next thing to consider is audio support, or rather, kind of the lack thereof. While audio isn't supported by native widgets, there are third-party plugins out there that can provide this functionality. Which actually brings me to my next point. So while there's a ton of plugins for Flutter, Some third-party libraries that developers have grown to love just aren't really available right now. You'll have to weigh the necessity of things like that versus working with what Flutter has before deciding to use the tool. Fortunately, there's actually alternatives for most things, but we'll kind of dig into that a little bit more later as well. And then finally, Flutter doesn't really have support for additional form factors like watches, televisions, and cars. So right now, Flutter has very limited support for Wear OS, which is the Google Watch OS, but no support right now for platforms like TV OS. So like we've talked about a little bit already, one of the biggest draws for Flutter for rapid prototyping is that it's an easy-to-use tool for creating custom UIs. So the first part of this presentation is where this talks a little bit more on the technical side. What I want to do here is give an overview of some of the ways that Flutter can be used to build out UIs. So when you're working with Flutter, everything is a widget, and all UI is described by widgets in a tree structure. So one key term that you'll see in Flutter documentation around this is aggressive composition, which essentially just means that aside from some very basic widgets, the widgets that you use in your app, either custom ones that you've put together or that come built into the platform, are going to be made up of other widgets. So you can kind of think of these like bricks where you just kind of connect them together to build what you want. So while there are hundreds of widgets out there, I just wanted to go over just kind of a few of them at a high level to give you an idea of this fundamental part of Flutter. So as a lot of you know, you can't really start with anything in the software world without Hello World, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at this example to get an idea of how Flutter uses widgets to create a bare bones user interface. All Dart apps use the main function as their entry point, and in there you can initialize various components and actually start your Flutter application. You can also see that we have a center widget in this example. This is just going to center all the content that you have within it in the middle of the device screen at this point. And then next up is a text widget that, as you can probably guess, is just going to show some text. So this text widget also has a few properties that can be applied to it. The first one is the string that will be displayed by the text widget. And the second is a named optional property. Now in this case, it's text direction that can be used to customize the widget. So all said and done, you kind of end up with this stunning example of a simple app that does pretty much nothing except says hello world, which totally okay for what we're doing right now. So the next component that I want to talk about is the list. Since honestly, like 90% of apps that are out there are essentially just list and detail screens. So there's actually a lot that you can do with lists, like setting them up for infinite scrolling, having items react to long presses, and adding various custom composite widgets that each do different things. To keep everything simple for this example, we'll start by just looking at the code for a super basic list of generated text items that have a circle icon. So the first widget here is the scroll bar. Well, it's not necessary. It does provide, as you can probably guess, a scroll bar on the side of a list so that users know how far along in the data they are. After that is the actual list view widget, which provides the scrollable area that contains and controls the list of items. This widget also has a collection of properties that can be set to customize the list. So here you can see that we're setting up padding at the top and the bottom of the list view, though actually the only required property in here is the children array, and this will house the items that exist inside of our list. So this next part is where this component gets a little bit more interesting. So while you can include a simple list or even just an array data structure of other widgets, there's also this great list.generate call that can loop a set number of times to create widgets for your list view. So in this case, we'll simply create 100 items that will then be displayed inside of our app. Each of these 100 items will be made up of a single list tile widget. So this is going to implement the material design spec for your list items, and it's completely out of the box, which is great when you just want to throw something together really quick. So yeah, so this will generally just display some like text and a leading item, like an icon for each of those list items. And then, as you might expect, this list tile has its own properties. So the first one is the exclude semantics widget, which wraps a circle avatar. So what this will do is it will display the text, or rather the index from the list that we generated as an icon at the start of the list item. And then since it's wrapped by this exclude semantics widget, it's not going to be read by accessibility tools like screen readers, meaning it doesn't just add a whole bunch of noise for users that need to use those tools. And then the final part of the list tile widget in our list view, it's probably the most simple. So it's just going to be a single string in a text widget, and that's going to represent the content of our actual list item. So here we're just taking the index, turning it into a string, and then appending it onto this generate item or generated item text. Cool. So for the next few slides, I just want to introduce some widgets that I think were particularly useful for developers who are just starting with Flutter. And then I'm not going to get into too much detail in code and whatnot for the sake of time, but I just basically want you to know that they exist. And then if you need to use them, you can find all the information and whatnot for them online pretty easily. You can even reach out to me and I'll send you links and all that sort of good stuff. So the first of these useful widgets is the card widget, which provides a card item that can be put into your list views. So these cards are also containers, which means that you can create really complex and completely custom UIs that you then put inside of them, but you still get that nice card shape and shadowing and all that stuff to really distinguish your items from each other. And then next up is the text field widget, which allows users to enter text into your app. So you can see here that there's a lot of ways that you can customize a text field, such as restricting it to numbers, hiding entered characters for passwords, or even just validating content based on values that are in other parts of your app. I'll just let this video play through here real quick. And you can see that it actually validated against the password. Cool, and then finally there's the picker widget, which will let your users pick out dates from a calendar or clock without having to recreate this common UI flow. Oops. I guess I'll go back and let you see this one play out as well. So you can see it actually has a calendar built into it as well. So this used to be a third-party library that you have to bring in for like Android or some other apps or platforms. And there's also a clock that shows up as well. So if you need to select a time out of it in addition to the calendar, it's all actually built into this picker widget. So far we've covered just kind of a small handful of common widgets, but we haven't even broken the surface on how many are actually out there. So to learn more, I really recommend that you check out the Google Developers YouTube channel to find the Widgets of the Week videos and to check out the official widgets reference documentation at flutter.dev. Those are actually, if you are writing, flutter.dev, great one to just pull up in a browser or save in a text file or what have you. Or again, this will all be in the slides that I'll post out there later as well. So now that we've covered some common widgets, I just want to get in some stuff that's a little bit more interesting and useful when it comes to actually learning the platform quickly and then creating some prototypes. So the first tool that's great for getting up and running quickly is the Flutter Gallery app. So this app is entirely open sourced and it's available on GitHub, meaning that you can grab whatever functionality that you like out of it to throw into your prototypes. So it goes over a collection of widgets that you can use with both Material and Cupertino stylings, which is the way iOS apps look. And it also has a whole lot of other useful features that you can just kind of mess around with in this little playground app that you just install and change and mess around with. So each widget section in the Gallery app is going to include a descriptor, and you can actually bring up the code that was used to create that section. Each widget page also has an icon at the top that will take you directly to the official documentation for the widget that you're looking at. Additionally, there's a variety of tools out there that you can kind of just see in this app to see how to do animations, media playback, or even like just displaying the available stock colors that are in Flutter. So you can kind of put your apps together a little bit faster just by seeing them in actual use. And the Gallery app also includes case studies. So you can see how common features are going to work together in a big picture scenario, rather than just a bunch of one-off widgets. So here you can see that we have a staggered grid view, hero animation, which is when you click on an item and it kind of expands to fill in the screen as it goes to the next page. Circular animations and different types in a single list. And there's a few other things that are just kind of in this set of screenshots that are pretty useful. So this is great when you're trying to put together a quick prototype, as you get examples of animations and interactive components right out of the box, rather than spending a bunch of your time trying to figure out how to work through already solved problems from random blog posts, Stack Overflow, or just other documentation in general. But speaking of the documentation, you've probably noticed I've already mentioned it a bit already. So I'm a huge fan of what the Flutter team has already put together, especially since a lot of it isn't just the standard, this component does something without a lot of examples that goes with it. One of the things that they have is the Flutter Cookbook, which is a documentation page containing various code samples. And they're actually called recipes, which is where the name comes from. But they cover a lot of common tasks that you might want to do in Flutter, and it's just all there and available for you to copy, paste, and play with. So this is just kind of a sample of what's there, but you can see that there's a lot of great content that you'll use in almost any app, such as animations, design elements, and networking. So the next thing to talk about, plugins, and I've mentioned them a few times, but we haven't really gotten into what they are. They're essentially just kind of a fancy word for libraries or modules, but they're one of my favorite things about Flutter. Because the development community is so active and passionate about the platform, they've created thousands of open source plugins that you can use in your app to easily accomplish tasks without having to just reinvent the wheel. So you can find most of these plugins by using pub.dev, which is a site that was created by Google for searching through plugins and finding their documentation as well as their source code. You can find the specifics for implementing pretty much any plugin that I can think of through this exact site. And then I'm going to bring in a couple of these to talk about as well. And then we'll just, I don't know, just introduce them here, I guess. And if you're interested in learning more about them, I'd recommend going to this pub.dev site and then just actually searching for them, and they'll find all the actual details for implementation, what they do, what the source code looks like. So if you want to do anything special with them that's not covered by their little README file, anything of that sort. So while there's a ton of great third-party plugins out there, I figured I would actually start with Google Maps, since it's one of my favorites and kind of my go-to when I want to display location information for my users. So this plugin will display a map for your users, and it'll allow you to customize it with styles and pins and drawing on the screen. Pretty much anything that you can think of that you can do with Google Maps, like on the web, you could do with the mobile app and put it into your apps. And then next up is Flutter. So Flutter is actually just this really cool third-party plugin that I thought was just too cool to not include in this talk. So this plugin is great when you want to animate icons, buttons, and some other items in your app to add some extra kick to your UI, which is just always great when you're trying to sell an idea to somebody or show it off for a hackathon judge. It's worth noting that you can do some of this manually using native widgets like Animation Builder or Transform, but it's just not really as easy. But you can see that it does this like spinning and fading animations and all this other stuff. They actually have a web tool you can use to design this, set up your keyframes and edit it and make it just look like this essentially. And then what it'll do is it's going to export a little JSON file that you include in your app. And then you just include that for the I think it's called the Flare Actor widget. I'd have to look at the documentation again. But that's how you'd get this in here, and you actually design everything through a UI tool. Cool, and then while we've talked a lot about rapid prototyping for just strictly UI apps, it's becoming more and more common that people need to make prototypes that consist of an app with a hardware device. So given this, the next plugin that I want to introduce is FlutterBlue. This is basically just a plugin that helps you communicate with Bluetooth devices using a Flutter app. So this handles finding, connecting, and communicating with BLE devices with only just a few lines of code. And it's invaluable for anyone that's actually working on an IoT project. So if you need to work with hardware and it's going to go over Bluetooth, this is the plugin that you'll want to look into. Since there's hundreds of plugins out there, I can't really even begin to make a dent in describing all of them in a series of talks, let alone a single talk. But I would really recommend that you search for anything that you're trying to do in Flutter first to see if someone has already made a plugin that can help you out. It'll save you just a lot of time and headache and so forth. You can see that a lot of them will work on both mobile and web. So I have an example of this charts library working on web as well as on a mobile device. I have this like really cool animated menu pop-up one that I found. Yeah, there's just a ton of stuff that's out there though, and I really recommend just checking into whatever you would need and things that would be useful for you. Cool, so for the next part of this talk, we'll learn a little bit about Firebase and how it's used with Flutter through Google's open source plugin, which is called Flutterfire, and you can also find that up on pub.dev as well, or it's up on GitHub. So first, let's just go over the official pitch for Firebase. So Firebase is an application development platform with a mission to help app developers succeed by using Firebase products. Firebase accomplishes this by taking common problems and developer tasks that occur during a product's lifecycle and making them easier to solve, be it by providing more information about your app and their performance, or providing tools to handle complex problems like security and network connectivity when you're storing data. Great, so Firebase is actually divided into these like three main categories of tools, and each of those has a specific goal. So the first one is this build category. So what this does is it helps you build better apps by making complex coding processes easier. Or there's improving app quality by helping you catch issues early and fixing them quickly. And then finally, there's helping you grow your app by understanding how others are using it and engaging with them in kind of a meaningful way. So as you can see, there's like 20 different products here, and we don't have that much time. So what I'm going to do here is focus on the features that are going to be the most relevant to rapid prototyping. So again, the goal here isn't to overwhelm you, but rather just to let you know what is available when you need it. And this just is meant to give you kind of a foundation so that you can go out and learn more of it when you're interested in it. So the first feature that I want to go over is authentication. While it's not the most flashy feature, there's always going to be that one hackathon judge that's going to ask you about security. So you might as well just toss it in since it's easy enough to use. Firebase authentication will allow your users to log into your app using a name and password, a phone number, a third-party identity provider like Google or Facebook, or a few other options. So to keep things short, I'm just going to go over how to use Google Sign-In. So from my own experience, this is probably the easiest of the third-party authentication methods that you can use, but that's also because we have this Google Sign-In plugin that helps streamline this process. If anyone is interested in like a really detailed look into Firebase authentication, I actually have a whole series of blog posts up on Medium that I've recently released that goes over how to use Firebase Auth with Flutter for email and password, email link, Google Sign-In, GitHub Sign-In, which is one that we'd actually had a lot of people request just because it was a little bit more complicated. And then I just did SMS and phone auth as well as anonymous. And I'm going to be doing another one here pretty soon on custom authentication and account linking. Sorry, that was kind of a lot. If you want to know more, there's more on Medium. And you can just reach out to me if you have any other questions with that part. Cool. So a major part of the setup process for Firebase authentication occurs in the Firebase console. So aside from linking your app to Firebase, you'll need to enable each type of Firebase authentication that you'll want to use within your Firebase auth section in the Firebase console. So after project setup and enabling auth, though, you can actually just get right back into the code for your app. So the first thing you'll need to do in your code is instantiate the Google Sign-In object, then call the sign-in method on it. So this is what's actually coming out of that Google Sign-In plugin that I had mentioned earlier. And this is going to retrieve their credentials from their Google account. If the user's device is able to use Google Sign-In, then they'll be prompted with this sign-in dialog that looks kind of like this. This comes up on Android. If they're using iOS or web, what it'll do is it's going to open up another browser window where they can just kind of sign in through the normal Google Sign-In pages, but it still returns those credentials to your app when it's ready to send all that information back. And after the user has selected their account, you'll receive this Google Sign-In account object. So you can use this to call authenticate against Google's identity provider service. And then once the user is authenticated, you can retrieve their auth credentials from the Google Auth provider, which is a part of the Firebase Auth framework. And then finally, you can retrieve the Firebase user using their Google Authenticator credentials. Additionally, if the user has already been previously authenticated, then you can actually just retrieve the Firebase user using the current user method, which is what you see as the last line that we've highlighted here. And then next, I just want to talk about the two database options that are available in Firebase. So the first one, real-time database, is going to use a simple JSON tree structure to store and access data. So this data is stored in sync between users and devices, and its main goal is to provide a backend data storage solution without having to go through the whole tedious process of setting up your own database server, authentication schema, REST endpoints, and basically everything else that goes along with building a typical like database infrastructure. So the first thing you'll need to do to use the Firebase real-time database is actually create a Firebase database object in your app. You can then create a reference to a specific node in the JSON tree structure. So in this case, the node is actually just going to be called messages, and it's a child of the root node. So that's where this .child messages part is going to come from, based off of that database reference, which is pointing to the root of the structure. You can actually just create as many of these references as you like as well, just depending on what you need to do in your app. So in this part of the code, what we're doing is we're going to create a reference to a counter node, which is also going to be coming off of the main root. So there are going to be two simultaneous nodes on that data structure. And then all we're going to do here is just read that value once before we actually print it. So you can see that we're using this once parameter here on database reference child with the counter value passed in, and then just once. And then once that gets retrieved, then we just call then, which means once we actually have this data, then we're going to do something, in which case we're just going to print out the message and the value. And then after you have your reference, you can actually associate it with the listener in order to take any actions on that data that you would need to do as they actually happen. So here we're just going to continuously listen to the messages reference that we have using this stream subscription. And then we're just going to say, hey, give me the last 10 items that are available on there whenever any kind of item is added onto this data structure. And then again, we're just going to print it. And then finally, I just wanted to introduce this new graphical widget from the Flutter library, which is called Firebase Animated List. So this is going to work like a standard list, but what it'll do is it will animate as list items are added or removed. And it works specifically with a Firebase reference to listen for data changes without having you kind of retie everything back together manually. So if this widget doesn't work for your use case, then there's also the Firebase list and the Firebase sorted list widgets. Actually, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back a couple slides here. So I'm actually using that animated list here in this screenshot. So you can see how the items are kind of folding in as the new items come in. And as we delete items, they fold out. So you get that nice kind of fluid transition with your UI rather than just something abruptly showing up or disappearing. Cool. So the second option, which is Cloud Firestore, is a database tool that allows you to group data using a document collection structure for straightforward access. So what it does is it offers many of the advantages of the real-time database, such as real-time syncing, offline support, and scalability. But also it also just supports basic queries in addition to that direct data access that we had just seen. One thing that's important to remember here is that the Cloud Firestore can be used in conjunction with the real-time database. So they can be used at the same time, as each has its own unique purpose within your app. So actually, I'm going to skip the code discussion for the next few slides today, just because of time and whatnot. But you can find this and all of the other complete samples in the Flutterfire repo up on GitHub, or if you're using pub.dev. So while we've talked about the database options already, sometimes you need to store and serve user-generated content, such as images or audio files, directly into your mobile app. So you can do this using cloud storage for Firebase. So uploads and downloads are actually handled by the Cloud Storage SDK, and they're resumable, making them more resilient to changes in network connectivity. So when a user's connection is disrupted during an upload, the SDK will automatically handle retrying and resuming, which can be just very critical when you're dealing with the kinds of network connectivity issues and conditions that you're going to encounter when you're working with mobile devices. Downloading content is also going to use this similar system, which allows users to receive their data once a connection is successfully reestablished. Once the user's content is uploaded, it can be shared with other users of your app using the same SDK, and since you'll likely run into situations where only certain users should be able to see or upload very specific content, you can use Firebase's security rule system along with Firebase authentication to restrict content according to your app's requirements. And then we also have cloud functions for Firebase, which are just these single-purpose functions that are executed up in a secure, managed environment for your Firebase project. So these are powerful tools that let you handle complex logical operations from within Firebase, such as performing operations on your Firebase database or interacting with various other Google or even external services. So these are great for handling backend logic for your app without setting up a whole complicated backend, which is kind of a general theme of why Firebase even exists, just to make life easier for your developers, and as well as just getting analytics, analyzing it, making sure that your apps are as good as you can make them using our tools. So also at the last FireConf, well, I guess it's not the last one anymore because we just had one, but the one before that, back in 2019, we released a new product called Extensions, which are pre-made functions that handle common tasks for developers without having to just kind of reinvent and redo things that other people have already solved. So you can actually find these in the console to see what can work for your app. And there's still way more that are being released over time. We're trying to get as many of these available as we can for our users, just to make development even easier. Cool, so we've covered a lot today. If you want to learn more about Flutter or Firebase in depth, then the top few links will give you a ton of information and resources like code labs and videos. For Flutter, I highly recommend checking out the Flutter Codebook that we talked about earlier. And you can find more information about all the features available in Flutterfire out on GitHub. So again, my name is Paul Ruiz. I'll be posting the slides for this talk for anyone that's asking for them, or I can even send them to the organizers if that works as well. But my Twitter account is here. It's at TK14863. Or you can just reach out to me directly through my work email if you have fairly in-depth questions. So that's at that ptruiz@google.com. Cool. So thank you. And then if there are questions and whatnot.
Paul, thank you for your time. It was a very informative and well-made presentation.
Oh, yeah.
I hope we can see you more in our future events, but not only virtually, also physically, after the pandemic, of course.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add? There is still time.
No, unless there's questions. I don't know if we're able to take those or not, and if not,
let me check for questions. I think there's no questions.
Okay.
Okay, well then, have a nice day. It was nice to have you here.
Yeah, you too. All right, you have a good one. Goodbye.
Goodbye.